be looking at a set of two examples. Let's go ahead and go to Matthew chapter 21. Jesus gives us, on different parables, he gives us contrasting examples. Not only that, but there are definitely real world, what we can call real world examples that we can go to and show contrast. And the greatest contrast one could possibly see would be in places like Matthew chapter 4, where Christ is in the wilderness being tempted by Satan. There you have Christ, our greatest hope, with Satan, our greatest adversary. As a matter of fact, the adversary. And both of these individuals, Christ the Son of God and Satan, the one who truly is just all hate and spite and vindictive and just horrid, we see them both at work and seeing them as who they are. But if we go to Matthew chapter 21, we have a parable, very short parable that Jesus gives in this. And then he ends up with a question in this. But here are these two contrasting sons, beginning in verse 28. But what do you think? A man had two sons. And he came to the first and said, Son, go work today in my vineyard. So he has two sons. First one he goes to, asks him, go work today. More like more than a request. This is what you're supposed to be doing. Go work today in my vineyard. He answered and said, I will not. But afterward he regretted it and went. Then he came to the second and said likewise. And he answered and said, I go, sir, but he did not go. Which of the two did the will of his father? They said to him, the first. Jesus said to them, assuredly I say to you that tax collectors and harlots enter the kingdom of God before you. And we'll just read the next verse 32. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him, but tax collectors and harlots believed him. And when you saw it, you did not afterward relent and believe him. Here we have this parable. And this parable is describing two different types of people. And we see that in who Jesus is talking to and their response in all this, and Jesus' response to them. But a father has two sons. The father has a vineyard. He goes to the first and says, go work in the vineyard. And that son says, no, not going to. Goes to the second, and the second says, I will go. But the one who said he wouldn't does. When it comes down to it, that first one who said he wasn't going to do it, does in fact do it. To begin with, wasn't, but then regrets it and goes. The second one says the right answer, has the right words. It sounds good, sounds loyal, sounds like here's someone who's faithful to the Father, obedient to the Father. But that's as far as it goes. It's just lip service, nothing more than that. I go, then not going. Now, here we have this comparison of these two. Jesus asks which one did the will of the Father. Obviously, it's the one that went and did it. It didn't matter what they said. That doesn't matter. And I've heard those who have prison ministries, those who go and teach in the prisons, that they never listen to the words. That is, the minister himself, the one who does the teaching, never listens to what a prisoner says, because you have prisoners that will say what you want to hear. They always say, we look at the actions. They never listen to the words, they look at the actions, because there'll be plenty who will say the right thing, but they'll never do it. Others, they may be saying the right thing, but you look at the actions and they're doing the right things. So it didn't matter what the words were, it's a matter of what did they do. Now, here we have this comparison, and Jesus is comparing these individuals who, you have that of the Pharisees, you have the scribes, who they thought themselves as being the righteous ones, and they found themselves, well, they thought themselves being high among everyone else. And you have the commoners, then you have that of the tax collectors and the harlots. Those are the dregs of society. But what Jesus tells them is that the ones you call the dregs of society, that happens to be that first son. That first son that said they're not going to do the work, but yet they're the ones working. They're the ones doing it. They're the ones, if we will, go back into the parable, they're the ones in the vineyard. Whereas those of the scribes and the Pharisees and these chief priests and the elders of the people, all of these, they are that son that said, I go. And while the words were good, they were not obedient to God. They simply didn't go. They would look the part, evidently. They talked the right things, evidently. But when he says, assuredly, in verse 31, assuredly I say to you that tax collectors and harlots enter the kingdom of God before you. They're in it before you are. And then he speaks concerning John. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But tax collectors and harlots believed him, and when you saw it, you did not afterwards relent and believe him. They are the ones believing him. They're the ones that are following Christ. They're the ones, those lowest of society, those that these elders and chief priests and others look down upon. They're the ones actually following. Not only did they follow John the Baptist, but they're following Christ now. They're following him. Well, aren't those the worst of sinners? Well, one might say, I suppose they are. But what does that matter? What does that matter? They're now following Christ. What does it matter where they came from? What does it matter what they used to do? What are they doing now? That's all that matters. What are they doing now? And it didn't seem to faze any of these self-righteous at all. And matter of fact, they will condemn Christ for keeping company with such people. That's why he has to say, a physician is for sick people. Sick people need a physician. Where do you want the Christ to be? Well, if they would have been honest and answered such a question, they would want the Christ to be with them. And salvation is by their standard, not by God's standard. Salvation would be where they are the gatekeepers and not God himself. That's the type of salvation that they want. But fortunately, for the rest of us, that's not the way it is. That God is the gatekeeper. God is the one who decides what the standard will be. And lip service is not going to cut it. Lip service never works with God. Now, that's the first example. Let's go to our next example. Now notice, in this one, Jesus doesn't mention really anything other than you have a father and a couple of sons. But in this next one, he's going to make mention of groups now. And it matches quite well with what he just said in this parable of two sons. Let's go to Luke chapter 18. Luke chapter 18. I'm in the wrong place. Luke chapter 18 and beginning in verse 28. No, I'm sorry. I'm all confused now. Luke chapter 18, verse 9. Okay, Luke chapter 18, verse 9. Also he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. That's how this section starts. That's why he gives this next parable. Notice that they trusted in themselves, trusted in themselves they are the righteous, and others they despised. Others they despised. And now he's going to make mention of two groups, the Pharisees, and because this is going to be contrasting that of a Pharisee and a tax collector. Not to say that all tax collectors were righteous, by no means, but we have two individuals and how they viewed themselves. Two individuals and how they viewed righteousness. Two individuals and how they viewed God. And this is contrasted in this. Verse 10, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Okay, so this isn't just left as a father and two sons. This is contrasting the Pharisees and how they were responding, generally speaking, to God, and the tax collectors, generally speaking. And it's not to say that they were all like this, not to say that at all, because Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, was a Pharisee, and there were others that also were among the Pharisees, but they seemed to be different. But as a group, this represents their attitude. But here we have these contrasting examples. Verse 11, the Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. Now let's just stop right there. He's praying with himself. Now, what does that mean? That means that this is a show. That's all it is. He's not really praying to God. That's not what he's out to do. This is nothing but a display, a public display that he's just broadcasting to anyone who can hear. And no doubt this happened a lot. This sort of prayer happened a lot, and you were supposed to admire it. Jesus does not admire it, nor does he respect it, nor does he see it as even being remotely even remotely acceptable. And that here with this Pharisee, he's not praying to God, he's praying with himself. That is not very much of a prayer. That's not much of a prayer at all. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I thank you that I'm not like these others. Okay, and then, he might as well be naming names. I fast twice a week. He wants you to know now what he does. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. All right, what kind of prayer is that? Now that's very weak and shallow, and once again, it is there not for God's benefit, not as a prayer to God, but it goes no further than just the surrounding air. That's it. Others to hear. That's all it was intended to do. And what kind of prayer is it to where this person publicly is praying in the temple and is reciting the things that they do? All right, that's a self-righteous person doing that. And God has no respect for that. No respect whatsoever. That's not what a follower of God looks like. Never did look like that. Never did. And there's a generation that is right in their own eyes. And the Pharisees were like that. A generation that you cannot convince them they are wrong, but they're wrong. They consider themselves to be the righteous of the earth, and everyone else from all through time has been wrong, but somehow they are right. Somehow. And they've convinced themselves of this. Here is this man, and it's this public, his prayer. It's supposed to be a private prayer, but it's broadcast. Now, verse 13, and the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Okay, here's a very different thing. And just as we made mention this morning, You know, Christians are not, or members of the church, are not that way because they're perfect. They're that way because they know they're not perfect. And for those that want to demonize and want to try to see the church as being less than what it is, they'll look at people such as the Pharisees through time, such as the Puritans. Puritans were, Puritanism, while it came into this country, and in the beginnings of this country, Puritanism, not a good thing. It really was. Here recently, we were talking about that. You really would not want to live in a Puritan town. You wouldn't want to do that because they were severe and very self-righteous. That's what it all comes down to. And that you do these certain things that they demand are acts of righteousness, or else there's a severe penalty in that. Others, such as typically people will bring out the Crusades, or they'll bring out the Spanish Inquisition, or they'll bring out other things that were done supposedly in the name of Christ. But just because someone does something in the name of Christ does not mean that Christ authorized it, asked for it, or expected it. He didn't want any of those things. And he neither wanted this type of Phariseeism either. He didn't want there to be sects among the Jews any more than he wants denominations among those who call themselves Christians. Denominations that splinter off from the church. He doesn't want any of that. He wants obedience is what he wants. He wants the pure word being followed is what he wants. And here we have this tax collector who just sees that he needs God. He sees that and he knows that. And he's not praying with himself. He is praying to God. He is praying to God. And which one is humble? That's easy to see. Which one knows God? Well, that's easy to see. Which one is showing themselves really to be desiring God? That too is easy to see. Because one's a hypocrite and one's not. Both are sinners, but one is recognizing it and the other clearly ignores that. Sees himself as the prime example for others to follow. But as Jesus is pointing out in this, using him as an example, it's not an example to follow. It's an example to avoid. To use him as a bad example. Now we go to verse 14. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified, that would be the tax collector, rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. God will accept the humble, but he does not accept the arrogant. He does not accept those who exalt themselves as someone. And yeah, the church through time has had its, I think every generation has its Pharisees, though they won't take that name. Every generation has seen its tax collectors of those who know they need God and are very humble about it. Of those that want to exalt themselves and the others that they're not out to exalt themselves at all. They're just out to serve God. They want the mercy. They want the grace. They want salvation of God. That's all they care about. That's all they are going for. The rest, they don't want that at all, because that's not what the kingdom of heaven is about. Just going back to to Matthew, in what Jesus says back in Matthew chapter 21, in all of this, is that assuredly I say to you that tax collectors and harlots enter the kingdom of God before you, because they desire it. These self-righteous don't desire it. They don't desire it at all. They want their social standing. They want the praise of men. That's what they want. They want the greetings in the marketplaces. They want the best seats at the feasts. They want the recognition, the spotlight. That's what they want, and that's it. That's all they want. And that's their reward. That's all they get. If all you want is the praise of men, that's your reward. It will go no further than that. I couldn't help but thinking of someone, I'm not going to give the name, but it's a rather famous individual, and now passed on. And I saw a particular video of what would have had to have been the absolute height of that man's career. The absolute height. It wouldn't get any higher than that. And granted, it was grand. Granted, it was extraordinary, and he had the crowd, and he had them captivated, and he had them in control, and it was an extraordinary performance. But he's now gone. But what does it mean now? That little moment in time, probably lasting maybe 20 minutes. What does that give him? Nothing. You get the praise of men for a short period of time, and then it's gone. Then it's gone. It doesn't last. And it doesn't really, for the most part, it doesn't last in this lifetime. Eventually, those that were very famous in one decade, a couple of decades later, no one really knows or cares much about them. That's just the way it goes. That is the way it goes. Now, we want something a little bit more permanent than that. But let's go now to Mark chapter 14. And this is not a parable, but we have a contrast of two people. These are two people who have been following Christ. These are two people. One is an apostle. He has been performing miracles. And the other is a very humble woman. And she's not an apostle. She can't be. She hasn't been performing miracles as far as the text ever shows in any of this. But we go now to Mark chapter 14, and we begin in verse 3. And beginning in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came having an alabaster flask of very costly oil of spikenard. Then she broke the flask and poured it on his head. So here, she knows what she's doing. She does know what she's doing. You wouldn't do this just as a random kind of act, because this is costly. It is costly. You wouldn't do this to just someone that you may be friendly with, or someone that you might admire a little bit. You would do this, she did this to the Son of God. The Son of God who is about to be crucified. She has done this for him. And it is a thing of high honor and high appreciation for what he represents and what he has done for her. Because she came from a very low place. She is one of those dregs of society. That's not the way Christ saw her, but that's the way others would have seen her. And she breaks this flask, pours it on his head, but there were some who were indignant among themselves and said, "Why was this fragrant oil wasted?" She just anointed the Son of God, and you say it's wasted because you think that was too expensive for anointing the Son of God? My next words are you mad? There is nothing that is too expensive to anoint the head of the Son of God. There's nothing too expensive. You don't just decide you're going to be half-hearted about worship or half-hearted about honoring Him or half-hearted about in measuring something out of this is good enough. She was doing the best she could possibly do. And here is these words of indignation of, well, obviously he's not worth all that. Yes, he is, and more so. Obviously, that should not have been done. Why? Because it could have been sold and given to the poor. It could have been sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor. Verse 5, for it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor, and they criticized her sharply because of it. She has done this extraordinary act because it is extremely expensive. Oil of spikenard was 300 denarii, or denarii, however it's pronounced. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And she's doing it in honor and preparing him for the crucifixion and for his burial. That's what she's doing. Let her alone. But Jesus said, verse 6, let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me. You have the poor with you always, and whenever you wish to do, you may do them good. But me you do not always have. If it's the poor you're interested in, you could be doing that. Nobody's going to stop you. You have that for the rest of your life. Nobody's going to stop you. You do that. You take care of the poor. If that's what you're actually interested in, which comes down to it, if that's what you're actually interested in, and Judas Iscariot had no interest in that whatsoever. He was interested in himself. He is caught in a trap, and sin has conquered him. Verse 8, she has done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. She has done what she could, and what she could was an extraordinary thing. She can't keep him off the cross. Nobody can do that. She can't take any of the suffering away from him. Nobody can do that. All they can do is just observe it happen. And she is the only one doing this. Someone like Peter has been saying he'll die with Jesus, which he doesn't. He denies him instead. Others are just there to observe, and that's about all they can do. And Judas, of course, is there to make money off the whole thing in betraying Christ. Assuredly, I say to you, verse 9, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her. And that's what we're doing this evening, as a matter of fact. Let's go to the book of John. John chapter 12. John 12 and verse 1. Just John and what he has to say about this. Verse 1, then 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus was, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it. Here we have this contrast of a woman who, Mary takes this and anoints him. She pours it on his feet. And it's a preparation for his burial, because he's already said that. In Mark, he has said that. That is, and that's what he says in verse 7 here. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. For the poor you have with you always, but me you do not have always." Now, she is willing to do this. She's willing to do this. But what about Judas? What's he willing to do? Make money because he's going to betray Jesus. That's what he's going to do. You talk about contrasting two different people. Two different people of Mary, who knows what's about to happen because Jesus has been telling them. She didn't just guess it. He's been telling them, and he's been telling them quite pointedly, and he's told them more than once that this was going to happen. And this is what she has done. And it says that she has kept this for the day of my burial. That this is what she had planned to do. And she had planned it for a while, I suppose. But she knows what's about to happen. And so does Judas. Judas also knows what's about to happen, because it's been in his mind, and he is going to be making a contract. He's going to make an agreement that he is going to betray the Christ in a place where there won't be a large crowd to bother his arrest. It'll just be a few of the apostles. It'll just be a few people. That's it. And so the arrest can be done quite neatly without causing an uproar. That is very much an enormous contrast of two people. One who has an extraordinary love and an expected love for the Son of God, and the other who's just using the position that he has to make money. That's all he's been doing. He's a thief. He's been taking, but he wants you to be generous. He wants you to be generous because he's taking that money. That's what he wants. He wants to have that spikenard and sell it so it'll go into the money box and he can utilize it to whatever he wants. He has been using Christ as a means of theft. Did Christ authorize that? No. Did Christ know it was going on? Yes. And don't think that Judas wasn't warned about what he was about to do, because Jesus does warn him. He warns him in speaking in general terms about the one who's going to betray him. And Judas is in that room knowing he's going to betray him. And then speaking to him directly. He's warned. Now with both of them, Judas didn't receive less love or less teaching than the rest of the apostles or even the other disciples. He is given every opportunity to do the right thing. Every opportunity. And Christ gives him mercy. And Christ, of course, Judas is his own person. He's going to do what he's going to do. It's not authorized by Christ, but it is allowed by God, because God is not going to stop you from making some horrid mistake. You're allowed to make mistakes. That doesn't mean it's respected. That doesn't mean there's not a penalty because of it. But you're allowed. You have that ability. And God's not going to step in to stop you from doing such a thing. He's not going to do it. Now, with these examples, we see that of, first off, with the two sons and the Pharisee and the tax collector, we have individuals that the Father calls them to do right, to work in the vineyard. One says no, but does it. The other says yes and doesn't do it. And then we have these two followers of Christ. They did follow Christ. One who has a true devotion and appreciation that she shows by this gift, and an understanding of what's going to happen, an understanding of it. And the other also knowing that he's going to be betrayed because he's going to be the one that's going to betray him. He knows he's been among those who've been plotting, and he's been plotting himself. And you know, there's no one but Jesus who knew what was in Judas's mind other than Judas. There was no apostle that knew what was in Judas's mind. And I doubt that even the chief priests and the elders of the people knew what was in Judas's mind until he went and made a deal with them. And they were very pleased that they had someone on the inside that could help them arrest Jesus so that they could put him on the cross. Now for us, we need to examine ourselves. Which son are we? And is the being a disciple of Christ, is that in complete honor of him, or just tagging along for the advantages of it? Tagging along simply because? Which is it? And we need to look at our own lives and make the adjustments and answer questions honestly to ourselves. Answer those questions. We ask this evening that we look at our lives, and judgment will be here one day. One day will be the day of judgment. How far is that? There's no knowing, but we're now one day closer and 1 hour closer. And it will arrive, and everyone will see him. And there's not a single person there that will be denying the existence of God. Not a single person would be able to do that. Even the demons believe and tremble. Right now, there are folks, they don't tremble at all, while knowing they're living a godless life. Let's not be that. Let's not be like the hypocrites. Let's not be like Judas in living a double life. Let's be the good example. Let's follow that. We ask this evening, if you need to respond to the invitation, that you come as we stand and sing.